Just before sunset, on the 15th of June, 1389, a tent on a field in central Kosovo went silent. A sultan lay dead inside it. The army around the tent had just won a battle. They did not yet know they had no commander. Their commander's son was on horseback at the far end of the field, taking control of the army, and the army was about to obey him. The chronicles tell different stories about how the sultan died. We will get to those. None of them are the whole truth. What the chronicles agree on is this. At some point that afternoon, on the field of blackbirds, the man who had built this empire stopped being able to give orders, and the empire kept giving them. This is how a frontier emirate became a state, and how the man who built it paid for the transformation with his life. His name was Murad. He was the second son. The story of how he ended up sultan begins, as so many Ottoman stories do, with a horse. In 1357, his older brother Süleyman Pasha, the man who, 3 years earlier, had walked his men through the broken walls of Gallipoli and into Europe, was thrown from his horse during a hunt at Bolayır near the Dardanelles. He died from the fall. His tomb still stands on the hilltop overlooking the strait he was the first Ottoman to cross. The heir was gone. 5 years later, in 1362, the second Sultan Orhan died in Bursa at the age of nearly 80. The succession passed to his younger son, and Murad, who had not been raised to govern, found himself the ruler of a state that no longer made geographical sense. His father had taken Bursa in 1326 because Bursa, a Byzantine commercial city in northwestern Anatolia, was the natural capital for a frontier emirate whose horizon was the Sea of Marmara. By 1362, the horizon had moved. The Ottomans held land on both sides of the water. Their armies marched out of Edirne, not Bursa. Their tax revenue came from Thrace. The contested borders of the state were 300 kilometers north of any sultan's residence. A capital is a confession about where a ruler thinks the future is. The date is conventionally placed in 1369, though Halil İnalcık and others have argued for somewhat later. The consequence is the same. Murad moved his court out of Bursa and into Edirne, the city the Greeks had called Adrianople, on the European side of the Dardanelles. This was the first time in Ottoman history that a ruler picked up his court and crossed the water with it. The dynasty had been founded on a frontier between two empires. Murad now placed its capital inside what used to be one of them. The Beylik was over. Something else had begun. This is the moment the empire became something other than a chief and his retinue. His father had ruled by being present. He had walked the frontier himself. He had sat at the same table as Ibn Battuta and counted his fortresses in his own voice. Murad built a state that ran without him. He had 3 tools. The first was an army that did not go home. Until Murad's reign, Ottoman warfare had been done by Ghazis, frontier raiders, free riders who fought for plunder and went back to their farms. The historian Heath Lowry has cautioned that the early evidence is messy, there is no clean founding decree. But under Murad, an existing practice began to harden into an institution. The practice was the Devshirme, a periodic levy of Christian boys from Balkan villages, brought to the capital, converted, and trained as the personal infantry of the Sultan. They were called the Yeniçeri, the New Army. They were the first standing infantry force in Europe since the fall of Rome. The architect of this transformation was a vizier named Kara Halil Chandarlu, founder of a family that would supply grand viziers to the Ottoman state for the next 100 years. The second tool was the Timar, a military land grant. A cavalry officer was assigned the tax revenue of a specific district in exchange for showing up to fight when the Sultan called. The land remained the state's. The officer remained the state's conquered territory, funded the conquest of the next territory. The provincial map of the empire became a budget document. The third was law. Under Murad, the Kanun-Name tradition began written secular law issued in the Sultan's name, alongside the religious law of the Sharia. Other rulers in the region claimed to apply God's law. Murad began also issuing his own, and running quietly underneath all of these, the title itself. On Murad's coins, in his letters, in the chronicles, he is now called Sultan, His father had been a bey, a chief. The new word meant peer status with the Mamluks in Cairo. It meant, the empire I lead is not a tribal arrangement. It is a sovereign state, 3 institutions, 1 title. Together, they made a state that did not depend on whether the man at the top was alive. His son would prove the point 27 years later, on a field in central Kosovo. The state was tested first in Bulgaria. In 1371, 2 Serbian kings, the brothers Vukašin and Uglaje Shah Mernjavčević, gathered a coalition and marched east into Thrace to drive the Ottomans back across the Dardanelles. They camped on the banks of the Maritsa River, near a place called Chirmen. That night, an Ottoman raiding force, much smaller than the Serbian army, found their camp. The historian Stephen Reinert, who has written the most careful study of Murad's reign, describes what followed as one of the most decisive surprise actions in medieval Balkan history. The Ottoman riders attacked in the dark. The Serbian camp panicked. Both kings died, Vukašin and Uglaje Shah, in the same chaos. By morning, the Serbian coalition had ceased to exist. In a single night, the balance of the Balkans south of the Danube became a matter for Edirne to decide. The next 15 years were a slow, almost methodical absorption. The Bulgarian tsardoms of Tarnovo and Vidin became vassals. Plovdiv, the old Roman Philippopolis, was already Ottoman. Sofia fell in 1382, Niš in 1386. The Macedonian city of Monastir, the Greeks called it Bitola, came under Ottoman control. The Albanian highlands and northern Greece became contested. The Byzantine scholar Demetrios Kidanes, writing letters from Constantinople in these years, sounds like a man watching weather close in around a house. The Ishmaelites, he writes, advance and his city does nothing. While the empire pushed west, Murad turned briefly east. The Kahraman emirate in central Anatolia, the strongest of the remaining Turkish beyliks, and the one that had been claiming leadership of the Anatolian Turks for half a century, was finally confronted. In 1387, at a place called Frankyazusu, Murad's forces defeated them in open battle. The Karamans were not annexed, but they were ended as a strategic rival. The eastern flank was secured. The empire could now afford its next confrontation in the Balkans. By the spring of 1389, the Ottoman state stretched from the Adriatic backcountry to the Anatolian plateau. Most of the smaller Christian rulers in the Balkans, Bulgarian, Albanian, Wallachian, had accepted vassalage. One had not. In the Serbian heartland, what medieval Serbs called the cradle of their kingdom, a prince named Lazar Rebeljanovich was assembling a coalition. Bosnia sent men. Albania sent men. Wallachia sent men. The collision was set. The Ottoman and Serbian-led armies met on the morning of the 15th of June, 1389, a date the Serbs remember as Vidovdan, Street Vitus Day. Murad commanded the center. His older son Bayezid commanded one wing. His younger son Yakub commanded the other. The Ottoman line held. Prince Lazar was captured during the battle and killed. And at some point that afternoon, Murad died. The Serbian tradition, which begins to take shape a generation later in the writings of Constantine the philosopher, fixes the killing in the Sultan's tent. A noble named Miloš Obilić, feigning defection, granted an audience, a dagger at the moment of greeting. The Ottoman chronicles place the killing on the field, after the battle, by a wounded Serb playing dead. The two traditions cannot both be true. We do not know which is. What we know is what they agree on. At some point that afternoon, on the field of blackbirds, the man who had built this empire stopped being able to give orders. And the empire kept giving them. Bayezid took command on the field. Within hours, he ordered his brother Yakub strangled. It is the first time, in this story, that an Ottoman brother dies for a throne. It will not be the last. Murad's body was carried back to Bursa, to be buried among his ancestors. His entrails were buried at Kosovo itself, at a place the Ottomans called Meshhed-i Huda Vendigar, the martyr's shrine of the Lord. The field became, permanently, Ottoman ground. His dynasty had been ruled, until then, by men who had to be present. He had spent 27 years building a state that did not. That afternoon, for the first time, it proved itself. Next Monday, Bayezid I, the man who took command at his father's deathbed, and the catastrophe 13 years later,